I found out about my own engagement party from a Facebook photo. Not a text. Not a phone call. Not even a passive-aggressive comment from a distant cousin. A photo. My Aunt Rima had posted it 40 minutes earlier, tagged "Congratulations to the happy couple," with silver balloons spelling out, "He said yes," strung across my parents' back porch. And there I was, in my own kitchen, 3 miles away, still wearing the ring on my finger, watching a party in my honor happen without me in real time on a 5-inch screen. I want to back up, though, because you need to understand who I was before that Saturday, so you understand exactly how far the fall was. My name doesn't matter for this story. Let's just say I was the daughter who always showed up. Not because anyone forced me to, because it was simply who I'd always been. I was the one who remembered my grandmother's medication schedule when nobody else could. I was the one who drove 2 hours each way for every single birthday, every anniversary, every just because Sunday dinner, even when I was exhausted from working doubles at the hospital. I wasn't the golden child. I want to be clear about that. I was never the one people bragged about at parties. I was the reliable one, the one nobody worried about, because I simply never gave them a reason to. And there's a difference between being loved and being relied upon. I didn't understand how big that difference was until the day of that party. Marcus and I had been together 4 years by the time he proposed. Ours wasn't a whirlwind romance, no grand gestures, no dramatic declarations. It was slow, steady, quiet in the way that real love often is. He wasn't flashy, but he was consistent, and after growing up in a house where affection often felt conditional, consistency was the most romantic thing I'd ever experienced. I remember the first time I brought him home for dinner, how nervous he was, how he'd practiced small talk in the car for 20 minutes, because he wanted my father to like him. My father barely spoke that night, the way he barely spoke about most things, but afterward he told my mother, in a rare moment of warmth, that Marcus seemed like a steady one. Coming from my father, that was practically a wedding blessing. My family liked him, or at least, they performed liking him well enough that I believed it. He came to every holiday dinner. He learned to make my grandmother's biryani exactly the way she taught him, standing in her kitchen for hours writing down measurements she refused to give in anything but a little of this, a little of that. He even asked my father for permission before proposing, the old-fashioned way, because he knew, somehow, that this small formality would matter to my dad more than anything else he could do. My father shook his hand that day and said only, "Take care of her," 4 words that Marcus still brings up sometimes, like they were the most important sentence anyone ever said to him. The proposal itself happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Nothing extravagant, just the 2 of us on our usual evening walk, a small velvet box he'd been saving up for 8 months to afford on his salary. I remember laughing through my tears because it felt so perfectly, quietly us. I called my mother before I even called my best friend. I remember her voice on the phone, bright, warm, "Oh my God, I'm so happy for you, we have to celebrate, you have to come over this weekend and tell us everything." I believed every word of it. I hung up the phone that night and told Marcus, half joking, that this was probably the happiest my mother had sounded on the phone with me in years. I didn't know yet how much that observation would come to matter. I need you to understand something about my family's dynamics, because it explains everything that came after. My younger sister Danielle was always the center of gravity in our household. Not because she demanded it, she wasn't cruel or manipulative, not exactly, but because everyone around her simply orbited her without question, the way certain people naturally pull focus in a room. She was louder than me, funnier at parties, the one who filled silences before they became awkward. I loved her. I still love her. But loving someone and understanding the price you quietly pay for their spotlight are 2 very different things, and I spent most of my childhood not realizing there was a price at all. When she got engaged 2 years before me, to her first fiancé, My parents threw her an engagement party with a live band, a catered dinner, string lights wrapped around the entire backyard fence. I remember standing in the corner that night, genuinely happy for her, telling myself it didn't matter that no one had ever done anything like that for me when I graduated nursing school, or when I got my first full-time position, or on any of the ordinary milestones that never seemed to warrant a banner. I told myself I simply wasn't the type of person who needed a big fuss. I told myself a lot of things back then that I now realize were just quiet lies I fed myself to avoid feeling the ache underneath them. That engagement, by the way, fell apart 8 months later. Nobody in my family talks about why, exactly, though I have my theories. Danielle went quiet for a while after that. Not sad quiet. Something closer to embarrassed, like the whole spectacle of that party had become a monument to something that hadn't lasted, and she couldn't stand walking past it. In the weeks after my own proposal, small things started to feel strange. Every time I brought up wedding dates, my mother would wave her hand and say, "We'll figure out the details later, sweetheart, don't rush it." Which seemed reasonable enough on its own. But then I started noticing that Danielle was getting texts from our mother that she'd quickly minimize whenever I walked into the room. I noticed my mother's calendar, sitting open on the kitchen counter one Sunday, with a date circled in red pen, no label next to it, just a red circle around a Saturday in October. I asked her about it. She said it was a dentist appointment for my father. I didn't think much of it at the time. I had no reason to. Phone calls got shorter. My mother, who used to talk to me for 45 minutes about absolutely nothing, the neighbor's new fence, a recipe she saw on television, a dream she'd had about her own mother, started rushing off the phone within 5 or 6 minutes. "I have to go, honey, things are just busy right now." Busy with what, she never said, and I never pushed, because pushing wasn't something I did. I was the easy one. Easy people don't push. Then came the moment that should have told me everything, if I'd only been paying closer attention. Marcus mentioned something offhand one evening while we were doing dishes. His mother had called him that day and asked, almost in passing, what he was planning to wear to the party. He'd assumed she meant a co-worker's birthday gathering would been invited to that same month, so he brushed it off and told her something casual, jeans and a button-down probably. It wasn't until much later, once everything unraveled, that we realized his mother had been talking about a completely different party. A party neither of us had been told existed. I remember standing at the sink that night, drying a plate, feeling something cold and formless settle in my stomach, a feeling I couldn't name yet, but one my body seemed to recognize before my mind did. I want to tell you about the days leading up to that Saturday in more detail, because in hindsight, the signs were everywhere, laid out like breadcrumbs I simply refused to follow. My cousin Priya texted me a strange, vague message that week, just a single line that said, "Hope everything's okay with you and your mom," with no context, which I brushed off as one of her usual dramatic non sequiturs. My Aunt Rima, normally chatty on our family group chat, went completely silent for 4 straight days, which was unusual enough that I actually asked my mother if Rima was upset with me about something. My mother laughed it off, too quickly, and said, "Don't be silly, everyone loves you. Everyone loves you." I would think about that sentence a lot in the days that followed, turning it over like a stone with something ugly underneath it. That Saturday in October, the one my mother had circled in red and told me to keep open weeks earlier under the guise of some dentist appointment that didn't exist, I was home folding laundry, half watching television, completely unaware that anything unusual was happening 3 miles away. Marcus was at the gym. I remember the exact moment my phone buzzed on the counter. A notification banner slid down from the top of the screen. My Aunt Rima's Facebook post. I almost didn't open it. I was mid-fold on a fitted sheet, wrestling with the elastic corners the way everyone does. But something made me pick up the phone anyway. Balloons? A banner. My parents' backyard, Decorated exactly the way they decorated it for Danielle 2 years earlier, the same string lights, the same rented tables with the same white tablecloths, the same caterer's logo visible on a chafing dish in the corner of the photo. And 30 people I recognized. My Uncle Farid. My grandmother's sister. Neighbors I'd known since childhood. All of them smiling in a photo that had nothing to do with me, except it had everything to do with me, because the banner strung across the porch, the one I could read clearly even at that small resolution, said my name. My actual name. Right there, next to Danielle's. Congratulations. I sat down on the kitchen floor before I even realized I was moving. The fitted sheet was still in my lap, half folded, and I just sat there staring at my phone, zooming in on that photograph again and again, as if enough magnification would somehow reveal that I was wrong, that this was some other family's backyard, some other daughter's name on that banner. It wasn't. I counted the faces in the photo 3 times. My name was there. My family was there. Balloons were there. I was not. I want to describe what that feeling is like, in case you've never experienced it, because words don't do it full justice. It isn't sadness at first. Sadness comes later, once the shock wears off enough to let it in. What comes first is a strange, hollow stillness, the kind that settles into your chest and makes even your own heartbeat feel far away, like you're watching yourself from somewhere just outside your body. I sat on that kitchen floor for I don't know how long. Long enough that my knees went numb against the tile. Long enough that the television in the other room finished whatever show had been playing and moved on to the next one without me noticing the transition at all. Eventually I stood up, because my body demanded it more than my mind did. I walked to the bathroom, I don't even know why, except that bathrooms feel like the only private room in most houses, the only door you can close and no one will follow you through. And I sat down on the closed toilet lid and I stared at myself in the mirror across from me for a long, long time. Not crying yet. Just staring. The kind of stillness that comes right before you fall apart, like the eye of a storm convincing you, briefly, that the worst has already passed. I called my mother. It went straight to voicemail. I called again, 30 seconds later, the way you do when some part of you believes urgency alone might change the outcome. Straight to voicemail again. I called Danielle next, my hands shaking now, adrenaline finally catching up to the shock. She picked up on the 3rd ring. I could hear music behind her, laughter, the particular ambient noise of a party in full swing. She said, "Hey," in a voice that was warm and completely unbothered, and for one brief, disorienting second I thought maybe I'd misunderstood everything, maybe there was an explanation, so simple it would dissolve this entire nightmare in an instant. "Where are you?" I asked. My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. There was a pause. Just half a second, but I heard it, the exact moment the noise behind her seemed to quiet slightly, like she'd stepped away from the crowd. We're just at Mom and Dad's, why? Is there a party?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I thought you knew," she said, and something in her voice had gone flat, careful, the tone of someone choosing each word like they were diffusing something. "I thought Mom talked to you about this." I didn't say anything for a moment. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. "There's a banner with my name on it," I said. "I'm looking at a photo right now. My name is on a banner in our parents' backyard, at a party I was never told about." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I almost thought the call had dropped. My mother finally called back almost an hour later. By then I'd moved from the bathroom to the couch, still in the same clothes, phone gripped so tightly my knuckles had gone pale. Her explanation, when it finally came, didn't hold together even for the length of one conversation. "We didn't want to overwhelm you," she said first. "You've been so busy with work, sweetheart, we just thought it would be easier this way." I asked her, quietly, How not telling me about my own engagement party could possibly be easier for me in any version of reality. There was a pause, and then the story shifted. It was actually more of a joint celebration, she said, her voice picking up a strange, brittle brightness, like she was improvising and hoping I wouldn't notice the seams. For you and your sister both. We didn't think you'd mind sharing it, since it's really about the family celebrating together. 2 explanations. Neither one matching the other. Neither one answering the only question that actually mattered, which was, if this party was for me too, why wasn't I there? I want to tell you about the next 48 hours, because they were, in some ways, harder than the party itself. I didn't sleep that first night. Marcus came home from the gym to find me sitting in the dark on the couch, phone still in my hand, and when I finally managed to explain what had happened, I watched something shift in his face, not just sympathy, but a kind of quiet, protective anger I'd never seen from him before. He didn't say much that night. He just sat next to me, and at some point he took the phone gently out of my hand and set it on the coffee table, because I'd been refreshing the same photo for almost 2 hours without realizing it. The next morning, I decided I wasn't going to let this go the way I'd let so many other things go over the years. I called my cousin Priya, the one who'd sent that strange, vague text days earlier, the one who always told the truth even when it was uncomfortable, even when the rest of the family preferred a comfortable silence. She hesitated for a long time before she finally spoke, and I could tell she was choosing her words carefully, the way people do when they are about to hand you something they know will hurt. She told me my mother had been planning this party for over a month. Not as a joint celebration in the spontaneous, last-minute way my mother had described it, as a deliberate, carefully organized joint engagement party for both me and Danielle, because Danielle, it turned out, had quietly gotten engaged again after her second failed relationship, to a man none of us had even met yet. And my mother had decided, apparently without a single moment of hesitation, that the 2 events would be combined into one, and that I simply would not be informed of any of it. Until after the fact.
I asked her why. Why would anyone plan a party for me and simply choose not to tell me it existed? Priya was quiet for a moment before she answered. Because your mom was worried, she said carefully, about tension between you and Danielle. She thought if you both found out about your engagements around the same time, it might feel like a competition, and she didn't want that to ruin things for either of you. I sat with that explanation for a long time after we hung up. Tension between me and Danielle. Tension that, as far as I could tell, existed almost entirely in my mother's imagination, built, I would later come to understand, from years of her own assumptions rather than anything I had ever said or done. I had never once resented my sister for the things she got that I didn't. I had told myself for years that I didn't need them. And somewhere along the way, my mother had taken my quiet acceptance and turned it into a story about jealousy that justified, in her mind, keeping me in the dark rather than simply being honest with either of us. The full picture came out in pieces over the following days, the way these things often do, not in one clean confession, but in fragments, extracted through phone calls and half-answered texts and one particularly tense conversation with my Aunt Rima, who hadn't realized, apparently, that I'd been excluded until she saw my absence in the party photos herself and quietly asked my mother about it, only to be told some version of the same shifting explanation I'd received. I learned that my mother had ordered a custom banner with both my name and Danielle's on it, the exact banner I'd seen in that photograph, as a kind of insurance policy. If I ever found out about the party, if I ever asked why I hadn't been invited, she could point to that banner and say, "Of course you were included. Look, your name is right there in lights." As if a piece of vinyl printed by a stranger at a party store could substitute for an actual invitation. As if being represented by a banner was the same thing as being present. I felt something in those days that I hadn't let myself feel in a very long time. Not sadness anymore. Sadness had already had its turn, in that first night on the couch. This was something sharper. Something closer to rage, though even calling it rage feels almost too simple for what it actually was. It was the specific, corrosive anger of realizing that being the easy daughter for over 2 decades hadn't earned me security or trust or even basic honesty. It had simply taught the people who loved me that my feelings were negotiable, optional, something to be managed around rather than considered. Marcus asked me, gently, a few days later, whether I wanted to let it go, the way I always had before, the way I'd let go of every slight and oversight for as long as he'd known me, because keeping the peace had always felt easier than making waves. I remember sitting across from him at our kitchen table, the same table where I'd once cried happy tears on the phone with my mother, and realizing that for the first time in my life, I genuinely did not want to let it go. No, I told him. Not this time. I want to walk you through what happened next in detail, because I think about it often, and I think the details matter. I decided I wasn't going to call ahead. I wasn't going to give my mother the chance to prepare an explanation or soften the confrontation into something manageable, or turn the whole thing into a private conversation behind closed doors where she could control the narrative the way she'd controlled it for the past several days. I put on real clothes for the first time since that Saturday. I did my hair. I looked, if I'm honest, like someone getting ready for exactly the kind of celebration I'd been denied. Marcus offered to come with me. I told him I needed to do this alone, and he respected that, though he made me promise to call him the second I left. I drove to my parents' house on a Wednesday evening, 5 days after the party, because I'd learned through the family grapevine that there was a smaller gathering happening that night. A kind of informal follow-up dinner for relatives who'd traveled in from out of town for the original party and were staying through the week. Which meant, once again, that a family event was happening at my parents' house that I had not been told about, that I was only aware of because Priya had mentioned it in passing, assuming I already knew. I walked in without knocking. I still had a key, after all, 26 years of being the daughter who showed up had at least earned me that much. The house was warm with the smell of my mother's cooking, the low hum of conversation drifting from the dining room, the particular sound of a family at ease with itself. I stood in the doorway for a moment, just listening, memorizing the sound of a normal evening happening without me. Then I walked in. Every conversation in that room stopped almost at once. My mother, mid-sentence, froze with a serving spoon still in her hand. My father looked up first, his expression unreadable in the way it always was. Danielle, sitting at the far end of the table next to a man I didn't recognize, her new fiancé, I assumed, went very still. My Aunt Rima's fork paused halfway to her mouth. I didn't scream. I want to be clear about that, because I think there's a version of this story people expect, where the wronged sister storms in and flips a table and says something dramatic enough to go viral. That's not what happened. I stood in that doorway, and I asked one question, clearly, calmly, loud enough for everyone in that room to hear. Can someone tell me why there's a banner with my name on it at a party I was never invited to? The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever experienced in my life. My mother set the serving spoon down. Her face had gone pale in a way I'd never seen before, and for the first time, I understood that the banner hadn't been a mistake or an oversight or even really an act of insurance in the way Priya had described it. It had been a decision, made deliberately, with full awareness of exactly what it would mean if I ever found out, which was that my mother would be able to say, technically, that I had been included, that my name had been there. That whatever hurt I felt was somehow a misunderstanding rather than the direct result of her own choices. Danielle spoke first, her voice shaking in a way that surprised me. I asked Mom not to make it about both of us, she said. I told her I wanted my own moment. After everything that happened with, she gestured vaguely, not finishing the sentence about her first engagement, the one that had ended so quietly. And Mom agreed. But then she decided that instead of just telling you the truth, she'd keep you off the guest list completely and put both our names on the banner anyway, so it would look like you'd been included even though you weren't actually there. I looked at my mother. She hadn't said a single word yet. Is that true? I asked her directly. She opened her mouth, and for a moment I thought another shifting explanation was coming, another version of events that wouldn't quite match the last one. But this time, something in her seemed to collapse under the weight of the silence in that room, under the weight of every relative sitting there watching her, waiting. I didn't want there to be tension, she said finally, quietly. I thought if I kept things separate, it would be easier for everyone. Easier for everyone, I repeated. Or easier for you? She didn't answer that. My father, through all of this, said nothing at all. He sat at the head of the table, the way he always had, his expression carefully neutral, and I realized in that moment that his silence wasn't neutral at all. It never had been. It was its own kind of decision, the same decision he'd been making my entire life whenever conflict arose in our household, to simply wait it out, to let my mother's version of events stand unchallenged, to avoid the discomfort of taking a side even when one side was clearly, obviously being wronged. That silence told me more about the pattern of my entire childhood than any single sentence anyone spoke that night. I stayed in that doorway a moment longer, looking around the table at faces I'd known my entire life, faces that had, apparently, spent an entire evening 5 days earlier celebrating a milestone in my life without me. Comfortable enough with my absence that no one had thought to question it out loud, at least not loudly enough for word to reach me before the party ended. I'm not going to make a scene, I said. I just needed you to know that I know. And I needed you to say it out loud, in front of everyone, instead of letting me keep wondering. I left the party without raising my voice again. I didn't need to. I could feel, as I walked back to my car, that the silence I left behind me in that house was louder than anything I could have said if I'd stayed and shouted for an hour. Word got around the extended family fast after that, faster, honestly, than I expected. My Aunt Rima called me 2 days later, her voice full of an apology that sounded genuinely stricken, explaining that she'd simply assumed, when she didn't see me at the party, that I must have had a work shift I couldn't get out of. My Uncle Farid sent a long, rambling text message saying much the same thing. Several cousins reached out over the following weeks, each of them expressing some version of the same disbelief, that they'd had no idea, that they would have said something if they'd known, that they'd simply trusted my mother's version of events without question, the way families often do until someone forces the truth into the open. My mother spent the better part of the next month fielding questions from relatives who had, until then, believed her general narrative that I was simply too busy to attend, or that some unspecified scheduling conflict had kept me away. I didn't go out of my way to correct the record with everyone myself. I didn't need to. The truth had a way of finding its own path once it was finally spoken out loud in that dining room. I want to be honest about the weeks that followed, because I think there's a temptation in stories like this to skip straight to the triumphant ending, and that's not quite how it went. There were nights I cried harder over this than I expected to, weeks after the initial shock had worn off, when the reality of it would hit me again out of nowhere, folding laundry, the same activity I'd been doing when I first found out, would sometimes bring the whole feeling rushing back. There were moments I second-guessed myself, wondered if I'd overreacted, wondered if I should just apologize for causing a scene and let the whole thing fade quietly the way so many family conflicts eventually do. Marcus talked me through most of those moments. He never told me I was wrong to feel what I felt. He never once suggested I should let it go faster than I was ready to. I didn't cut my family off entirely, and I think that surprises people when I tell the story, because there's an expectation that a betrayal this specific should end in a clean, dramatic severing of ties. It didn't, not exactly. What I did instead was quieter, and in some ways harder. I simply stopped auditioning for a role in their lives that was never going to be recast no matter how well I played it. I stopped being available at a moment's notice for every family request. I stopped assuming that my own silence, my own accommodation, was the price of being loved. I stopped calling my mother first after arguments, the way I always had, out of some instinct to smooth things over before they had a chance to fully exist. My mother and I had several more conversations over the following months, some of them harder than others. She apologized eventually, not immediately, and not without some amount of defensiveness woven into it, but eventually, in a way that at least acknowledged what she'd done rather than continuing to explain it away. I don't know if I've fully forgiven her. I'm not sure forgiveness is even the right framework for something like this. What I've settled into instead is something more like clear-eyed acceptance, an understanding of exactly who she is, what she's capable of under pressure, and what I need to protect for myself going forward as a result. Danielle and I talked too, at length, in a conversation that surprised both of us with how honest it became. She admitted, finally, to years of assuming I didn't care about the things she got that I didn't, because I'd never once said otherwise. I admitted, in turn, that I'd spent so long convincing myself I didn't need those things that I'd never given her the chance to understand how much some of it had actually hurt. We're closer now, strangely, than we were before any of this happened, not because the wound healed cleanly, but because we finally stopped pretending it wasn't there. Marcus and I planned our wedding exactly the way we wanted it after that, small, deliberate, full of people who had actually shown genuine excitement for us rather than people we felt obligated to include out of habit or guilt. We didn't invite everyone from that dinner table. Some relatives noticed. Some said something about it. I let them. I learned something in the months between that Facebook photo and my actual wedding day that I don't think I could have learned any other way. Being easy isn't a virtue if it means being erasable. Being the reliable one, the low-maintenance one, the one who never makes waves, none of that guarantees you'll be remembered, or included, or treated with basic honesty. Sometimes it does the opposite. Sometimes the people who love you learn, over years of your own quiet accommodation, that your feelings are the easiest ones in the room to set aside, simply because you've never given them a reason to believe otherwise. 6 months after that dinner table confrontation, Marcus and I got married in a backyard of our own, smaller than my parents' backyard, no rented tables with white cloths, no professional caterer. Just close friends and the family members who had actually shown up for us in the ways that mattered. My parents came. My father cried during the ceremony, which surprised almost everyone who knows how rarely he shows emotion. My mother sat in the front row and, at one point during the reception, pulled me aside and told me, quietly, that she was proud of me, a sentence I'd waited my entire life to hear her say without qualification. Danielle stood beside me the whole day, not performing happiness the way people sometimes do at weddings, but genuinely, visibly present in a way that meant more to me than any banner ever could. But this time, I want to be clear, I wasn't waiting for an invitation to my own life. I had built it myself on my own terms, surrounded by the people who had actually chosen to show up rather than the people I'd spent years convincing myself I didn't need to be chosen by. I used to think love meant never making waves. I used to believe that the highest form of devotion was simply never asking for more than what was offered, never questioning an absence, never making anyone uncomfortable by naming a hurt out loud. I don't believe that anymore. I think now that love which requires your permanent silence isn't really love at all. It's just convenience, dressed up in love's language, worn by people who benefit from your willingness to disappear quietly rather than speak up. You can be the easy one for 20 years and still get erased in a single afternoon. You can show up for every birthday, remember every anniversary, drive every long distance without complaint, and still find your own name reduced to a banner in a backyard you weren't allowed into. Being agreeable was never the same thing as being valued, no matter how long you convince yourself otherwise. So if you've ever found out about something that was supposed to include you through a photo you weren't tagged in, a group chat you weren't added to, a banner with your name on it that never actually meant you had a seat at the table, I need you to hear this clearly. You are not overreacting. You are not being dramatic. You are not the problem for finally noticing what was there all along. You are simply seeing clearly, for the first time, a pattern that had been quietly shaping your life long before you ever had the language to name it. And if this story felt familiar to you in any way, if some part of it landed somewhere close to home, there's more where this came from. Because the banner in the backyard wasn't the only secret my family kept from me over the years, and it wasn't the last time someone I loved decided that my comfort mattered less than their own. There's another story, one I haven't told publicly until now, about what happened at my own sister's wedding rehearsal dinner 2 years later, and trust me, it makes this one look small by comparison. If you want to hear it, that's the next video. I promise you, it's worth staying for.